One of the most bizarre things to ever happen to me involving video games happened in 1991 when I went on a quest to get a Super Nintendo. Something majorly wrong happened during that quest, and today I'm going to tell you the story of everything that happened, and it'll be the first time I've ever told you this story on YouTube before. It's very interesting, so stick around. So let's set the stage. It was 1991 and I was a 16-year-old. I had previously had the Atari 2600 in my house and I grew up with that. And then came an NES and I grew up some more with that. And around 1990, I got a Sega Genesis. So I was still growing up with that. But the hype surrounding the Super Nintendo was filling the magazines at the time, and I wanted that system as well. And it had a official release date for late 1991. I was keeping track of the video game world, mainly through reading Electronic Gaming Monthly, and you know, they had some great Super Nintendo coverage, and the ratings on the first batch of Super Nintendo games were very high. They had 9s and 8s and stuff. So yeah, I wanted a piece of that action. At the time, I didn't have a lot of money. I was working a part-time job in a grocery store. And at the same time, I was going to high school, of course. I was living with my mom, and it was just us together in the house. My siblings had all gotten older and had left. While I was working, I would sometimes spend entire paychecks on one Sega Genesis game because games were $50 and $60, and that was a lot of money in the early 90s, especially for a grocery store worker. Now, I did not have a car at the time. I just had a bike, and it wasn't even a 10-speed bike. It was just a BMX bike that I had since I was a kid, and that was my only mode of transportation, other than asking my mom to drop me off at various places. Now, this is not what I looked like at the age of 16. This was from much earlier, but that was the same bike I had when I was 16. I should have been saving up for a car, but I was spending my money pretty much as soon as I got my paychecks, and mainly it was on video games. But I did manage to save up $200 for the Super Nintendo, which once again was a lot of money back in the early 1990s. So I went to my mom and I told her that I intended to get a Super Nintendo, and she flat out told me, no, you don't need another game system. You need to be saving your money. I can't remember the exact details, but it was something to that effect. She also told me that she was going to visit her relatives in Tennessee. Usually I would come with her on these trips, but once again, I was going to high school and I was working a job, and so I didn't quite have the flexibility to do that. It could have also been I had no desire to go there at that time. I was a punky teen back then, so I basically said to myself, I'm gonna wait till she leaves, and then I'm just gonna go out and buy the Super Nintendo and disobey her. So I know that sounds bad. So she left to go to Tennessee, and I got on my bike and started driving to a place where I knew they were selling Super Nintendos. Now, this place was called Big Bear. If you've never heard of Big Bear, it was a supermarket chain, a pretty big one in the state that I lived in, at least. They had hundreds of stores everywhere, and they were around since the 1930s or something until like 2004. It was strictly grocery stores, but some of their locations were called Big Bear Plus. Big Bear Plus had general merchandise in addition to their grocery store items, like they had towels, they had electronics and stuff like that. It's similar to what a Target store would be like today, maybe a little bit smaller though. There was a Big Bear Plus near where I lived, and it was 3 miles away. So this would have been late 1991, I think November or so. I got on my bike and I started on this sidewalk that you see right here, and I began the journey. Back then I used to drive my bike on the actual sidewalk. I don't think people do that today, but it was a long journey. As far as I remember, up to that point, I had never driven 3 miles before. And certainly I've never driven through town on a bike with $200 of cash on me. But I wanted that Super Nintendo really bad, so I was willing to do whatever. over 30 years ago, I was on this sidewalk right here making this trip. There's a part of that route where the sidewalk ends and I have to continue driving on the road itself. And then I have to go over this large bridge, which you see right here. This is an overpass over a major freeway. So there I am, a 16-year-old driving what I consider a dangerous route over this overpass. I know some people wouldn't consider this much of a challenge, but I remember being very stressed about it, and I certainly would never take this trip on a bike today unless there was more room for the bikes. But I made it to the Big Bear Plus safely, and this is where it used to be located, at this strip mall. I think there used to be more windows around the entrance, but they've been plugged up with bricks, and the complex has been sectioned off into different little strip mall locations. It was a pretty big store, and I remember they had a display of Super Nintendos up front close to the entrance. I walked in and there was a big display of Super Nintendo boxes, and they had one of the systems playing on the TV, and it had Super Mario World on it. It was not one of those fancy Super Nintendo displays that you would see in other places. They basically took a TV from the store and hooked up one of the systems to it. The actual package they were selling was called the Super Set, and it came with Super Mario World, and I could not wait to get that home. And there was a pretty old man there working in this display area, and he was handing these systems to people who asked for them. I think he might have been behind a counter, I can't remember. But he handed me one, and I went to the registers and paid for it. I must have had it in a big bag, and I hung it on the handlebars of my bike, and I rode my bike all the way home to my house. Once again, I had the whole place to myself because my mom was visiting her relatives out of state, and I set that box on the ground. I opened a little tab on the side, and I pulled that styrofoam out. But the thing is, when I got the whole thing out, I looked down, and there was no Super Nintendo in the box, and there were no controllers. They had pretty much sold me an empty box. I was furious, and I was so disappointed that I had disobeyed my mom because I wanted this thing so bad, and the whole thing just ended up biting me in the butt. It was almost like karma or something. So why was there nothing in the box? I believe it was because they had used one of the systems for the store display that I talked about earlier. They had probably took one of the super sets and opened it up, took the system, game, and controllers out, and hooked it up to one of their TVs. And then the worker put the box back with the display with the other boxes. And when I came in, that guy handed me that same box. So I think it was all just a big accident. I apparently did not detect that the box was much lighter than it should have been. But you know, I was on adrenaline at that point. I was in the middle of a 6-mile bike journey, and I needed to get back. So I wasn't really thinking about that. I was probably thankful that it wasn't heavier than it actually was. But my mom eventually came home, and on that same day that she came home, I approached her and told her what had happened. I told her that I had gone against her orders and went up and got this Super Nintendo, and when I came back, there was nothing in the box. And I asked, please, could you take me up there to exchange this for an actual one that had a system in the box? So she surprisingly said yes. She could have just said, no, that serves you right for disobeying me or whatever. But I think she knew how much I wanted it. And, you know, I was paying with it with my own money that I earned from the grocery store. So maybe that had something to do with it. But she drove me over there, and I remember thinking they're gonna think I stole it or something, but that's not what happened. They gave me one, and I got home. This is the actual system that I got back then. This has been in my gaming setup forever, but I've had this ever since 1991. Now, I do remember replacing the shell on this one. The original one I had was fading big time, and I didn't like that in my game room, so I bought another Super Nintendo. Maybe it was not functioning or something, but I took the shell off that one and put it on this one. So it's mostly the same one I bought on that famous trip in 1991. I played a lot of the Super Mario World, and I played F-Zero a lot, at least when I first got it. This game, I was kind of disappointed with it. It just wasn't my thing. But eventually I ended up getting Super Metroid and Super Smash TV, and these two were my two go-to games for the Super Nintendo. During that time period though, I was still buying a lot of Sega Genesis games, and that was my primary system. At that time, Streets of Rage was coming out, and Sonic the Hedgehog was on the scene. It was an incredible time to be a gamer. I was a lucky kid. I got to enjoy the Atari 2600, followed by the NES, followed by the Genesis, and followed by the Super Nintendo. That is a pretty big block of fun, 4 different systems and all of these incredible games, and I'm just so happy I got to experience it. There is nothing else like it, no other time period like it. There will never be another time period like it. That's my story of how I got my Super Nintendo. I hope you enjoyed it. I have other video game stories that I will share with you one day. In the meantime, watch one of these other 2 videos. Have a great day, everybody.